Imagine digging through ancient soil, expecting to find pottery shards or old coins, only to uncover something that makes your blood run cold. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that forces us to question everything we thought we knew about human history. Every year, archaeologists around the world make discoveries that rewrite textbooks. But some discoveries are different. They're the ones that keep researchers awake at night, staring at evidence that challenges not just our understanding of the past, but our very sense of reality. Today, we're going to explore 10 archaeological finds that have left even the most seasoned experts disturbed, confused, and frankly, a little scared. These aren't just ancient artifacts. They're windows into a past that might be far darker and more mysterious than we ever imagined. Are you ready to see what lies beneath the surface of our world? Because once you know these secrets, there's no going back. Archaeology is supposed to be about understanding our ancestors, about piecing together the puzzle of human civilization. It's meant to be educational, enlightening, even inspiring. But sometimes, archaeologists dig up things that don't inspire wonder. They inspire dread. The discoveries we're about to explore share something unsettling in common. They all challenge our fundamental assumptions about the past. They all raise questions that have no comfortable answers. And they all leave us with the uncomfortable feeling that maybe, just maybe, there are some secrets the Earth was meant to keep buried. From mass graves that tell stories of unimaginable horror, to artifacts that seem to come from impossible time periods, these finds have shaken the archaeological community to its core. Some have been studied for decades without satisfactory explanations. Others have been quietly tucked away in museum storage rooms, as if keeping them out of sight might somehow make their implications less terrifying. But the truth has a way of surfacing, doesn't it? So let's dig deep and uncover the 10 most bone-chilling archaeological discoveries ever made. Discovery number 1, the London Plague Pits. Our first stop takes us beneath the bustling streets of modern London, where construction workers in the 1980s made a discovery that would haunt the city's dreams. While building the new Crossrail system, excavators broke through into what they initially thought was just another medieval cemetery. But this was no ordinary burial ground. This was a plague pit from 1348, during the height of the Black Death. And what they found inside defied every expectation about medieval burial practices. The bodies weren't carefully laid to rest. They were thrown in, layer upon layer, in positions that suggested desperate haste. Men, women, children, infants, all jumbled together in a chaotic mass of death. But here's what made investigators skin crawl. Many of the bodies showed signs of having been buried alive. Scratch marks on coffin lids, fingernails torn down to the bone. Bodies contorted in positions that suggested they had tried to claw their way out. The plague victims hadn't all died from disease. Some had died from premature burial, buried in their unconscious plague-induced comas, only to wake up 6 feet underground. But the true horror of the London plague pits goes deeper than individual tragedy. Archaeologists realized they were looking at the collapse of human civilization itself. The sheer number of bodies, estimated at over 50,000 in this single pit alone, told a story of a society that had completely broken down. Families had stopped caring for their own dead. The church had abandoned its sacred burial rites. Humanity had literally descended into throwing bodies into holes like garbage. Dr. Sarah Williams, who led the excavation, described finding a small child's skeleton clutching what appeared to be a crude doll. The image haunted her for years. Here was evidence of a world where children died alone, clutching their only comfort, while the living could barely manage to dispose of the dead. The plague pits of London remind us that civilization is far more fragile than we like to believe. They show us what happens when the thin veneer of society collapses completely. And they force us to wonder, if something similar happened today, would we behave any differently? Discovery number 2, the screaming mummies of Guanajuato. High in the mountains of Mexico, in the city of Guanajuato, lies one of the world's most disturbing archaeological sites. But this isn't ancient history. This is a horror that unfolded just over a century ago, and its victims are still screaming. In the late 1800s, Guanajuato implemented a burial tax. If families couldn't pay to keep their relatives buried, the bodies were exhumed and removed from the cemetery. But something unexpected happened to these displaced corpses. The unique mineral content of the soil and the dry mountain air had naturally mummified them, preserving them in stunning and horrifying detail. What makes the Guanajuato mummies so disturbing isn't just their preservation, it's their expressions. Face after face frozen in apparent agony, mouths open in eternal screams, eyes wide with what looks like absolute terror. These aren't the peaceful, serene death masks we're used to seeing in archaeological sites. These are faces that tell stories of unimaginable suffering. But here's where the story becomes truly nightmarish. Medical examination of the mummies has revealed that many of them show signs of having been buried alive. The telltale indicators are all there. Hands positioned as if they had been clawing at something, bodies contorted in positions that suggest struggle, and most disturbing of all, evidence that some had bitten through their own tongues in their final moments. How does someone get buried alive? In 19th century Mexico, medical knowledge was limited. Catalepsy, a condition that can make someone appear dead while still alive, was poorly understood. Comas were often mistaken for death. And in a time when death was common and burial was often rushed, mistakes were made. Fatal mistakes. One mummy in particular has become the stuff of nightmares, known as La Momia Más Pequeña, or the smallest mummy. It's the preserved body of an infant who appears to have died in utero, but whose face is frozen in what looks like a scream. The sight is so disturbing that many visitors to the museum housing the mummies leave in tears. The screaming mummies of Guanajuato force us to confront one of our deepest fears, the fear of being buried alive. They remind us that even in relatively recent history, the line between life and death was far blurrier than we might imagine. And they raise a chilling question. How many others throughout history met this same terrible fate, but weren't preserved to tell their story? Discovery number 3, the Antikythera mechanism. Technology that shouldn't exist. Sometimes the most frightening archaeological discoveries aren't about death at all. Sometimes they're about life that was far more advanced than it should have been. In 1901, sponge divers off the Greek island of Antikythera made a discovery that has been keeping scientists awake at night for over a century. Among the artifacts recovered from an ancient Roman shipwreck was a corroded bronze mechanism that looked like nothing anyone had ever seen before. For decades, it sat in museums, dismissed as some kind of decorative sculpture. But in the 1970s, when researchers finally took a closer look using X-ray technology, they discovered something that shook the foundations of what we thought we knew about ancient technology. The Antikythera mechanism was a computer, not metaphorically, literally. It was an analog computer designed to calculate astronomical positions and predict eclipses. Its gear system was so sophisticated, so precise, that nothing comparable would be created again until clockmakers in the 14th century developed similar mechanisms. This ancient device was technologically superior to anything that would exist for the next 1,300 years. But here's what makes this discovery truly unsettling. If the ancient Greeks could build this, what else could they build? What other technologies did they possess that we've lost or haven't discovered yet? The mechanism suggests a level of scientific and mathematical understanding that doesn't fit with our narrative of human technological development. Recent CT scans have revealed even more disturbing details. The mechanism contains gear ratios that are so precise they accurately model the elliptical orbit of the moon, with an error of less than 1 day in 19 years. This level of precision requires mathematical and observational capabilities that we didn't think existed until the Renaissance. Dr. Tony Freeth, who has spent decades studying the mechanism, described it as finding a jet plane in Tutankhamun's tomb. It simply shouldn't exist, but it does. And its existence implies that our understanding of ancient civilizations is fundamentally flawed. The Antikythera mechanism raises terrifying questions about lost knowledge. How much advanced technology has been lost to time? Were there other ancient civilizations capable of creating devices that we would consider impossible? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if they could build this 2,000 years ago, what happened to that knowledge? Why did humanity seem to forget how to create such sophisticated devices? The mechanism sits in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens, a bronze reminder that the past might be far stranger and more advanced than we're comfortable admitting. Discovery number 4. The bone churches of Sedlec. In the small town of Kutna Hora in the Czech Republic stands one of the most macabre archaeological sites ever discovered. The Sedlec ossuary, also known as the Church of Bones, contains the artfully arranged skeletons of between 40,000 and 70,000 people. But this isn't just a mass grave. It's something far more disturbing, a deliberate work of art made entirely from human remains. The story begins in 1278, when an abbot returned from Jerusalem carrying soil from Golgotha, the site where Christ was crucified. He sprinkled this sacred soil over the Sedlec cemetery, and word spread that anyone buried there would be guaranteed salvation. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be buried in this small Czech cemetery. Nobles, commoners, victims of plague and war, all found their final resting place in Sedlec's soil. But by the 15th century, the cemetery was overwhelmed. Bodies were literally stacked on top of bodies. The church hired a woodcarver named František Rint to deal with the overcrowding problem. His solution would become one of the most disturbing examples of human creativity ever documented. Rint didn't just move the bones. He turned them into furniture, decorations, and art installations. 4 enormous pyramids of skulls and bones dominate the chapel. A chandelier made from every bone in the human body hangs from the ceiling. Garlands of skulls festoon the walls. There's even a coat of arms crafted entirely from human femurs and rib cages. But what makes the Sedlec ossuary truly unsettling isn't just the use of human remains as decoration. It's the casual, almost cheerful way the bones are arranged. There's something deeply disturbing about the craftsmanship, the obvious care and artistic vision that went into creating beauty from human remains. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the value we place on human dignity after death. Archaeological analysis of the bones has revealed even more disturbing details. Many of the skeletons show signs of violent death, battle wounds, evidence of torture, indications of execution. These weren't just people who died peacefully and were later exhumed. Many were victims of medieval violence, their traumatic deaths literally built into the walls of a church. The Sedlec ossuary stands as a testament to humanity's complex relationship with death and mortality. It's beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. Visitors often report feeling deeply unsettled, not just by the presence of so many human remains, but by their transformation into objects of beauty. It challenges our most basic assumptions about respect for the dead and the sanctity of human remains. The Church of Bones forces us to ask, when does honoring the dead become exploiting them? And what does it say about a society that could create such a place and call it sacred? Discovery number 5, the bog bodies, perfectly preserved ancient murders. Deep in the peat bogs of Northern Europe, archaeologists have made discoveries that seem to blur the line between archaeology and forensics. These are the bog bodies, ancient human remains so perfectly preserved that they appear to have died yesterday. But these aren't natural deaths. These are murder victims, and their stories are written on their skin in horrifying detail. The most famous bog body, the Toland Man, was discovered in Denmark in 1950. When peat cutters first saw his face emerging from the bog, they called the police, convinced they had found a recent murder victim. The man's features were so well preserved that you could see individual whiskers on his face, the furrows in his brow, even the expression of peaceful resignation in his closed eyes. But radiocarbon dating revealed the shocking truth. The Toland Man had been dead for over 2,000 years. The acidic, oxygen-free environment of the bog had preserved him so perfectly that archaeologists could determine not just how he died, but what he had eaten for his last meal. And how he died was disturbing. The Toland Man had been hanged. A leather noose was still wrapped around his neck when he was discovered. But this wasn't a simple execution. The positioning of his body, the careful placement in the bog, suggested this was a ritual sacrifice, not a criminal punishment. As more bog bodies were discovered across Europe, a pattern emerged that has left archaeologists deeply unsettled. Nearly all of them died violently. The Grobel Man had his throat cut so deeply, he was merely decapitated. The Windeby girl had been blindfolded and drowned. The Holdremos woman had been stabbed and had her arm broken before being thrown into the bog. But perhaps most disturbing is what these bodies tell us about the societies that killed them. These weren't random murders. They were carefully orchestrated rituals. The victims had been well fed, their fingernails manicured, suggesting they held high status in their communities. Yet they were killed in the most brutal ways imaginable and deposited in sacred bogs like offerings to the gods. Recent analysis has revealed even more chilling details. Many of the bog bodies show evidence of multiple methods of killing. They weren't just hanged, or just stabbed, or just drowned. They were subjected to what archaeologists call overkill, multiple violent deaths inflicted on the same person. It suggests a level of ritualistic brutality that makes modern forensic investigators uncomfortable. The bog bodies force us to confront the reality that human sacrifice wasn't rare in ancient Europe. It was systematic, ritualistic, and probably seen as essential to the survival of entire communities. These perfectly preserved faces look back at us from across 2 millennia, silent witnesses to a time when the most sacred act a community could perform was the ritual murder of their own people. What's most unsettling about the bog bodies isn't just that they were murdered, it's how peaceful they look. There's no sign of struggle, no evidence of fear in their final moments. They seem to have accepted their fate, and that, perhaps, is the most chilling detail of all. Discovery number 6. The Headless Vikings of Dorset. In 2009, road workers in Weymouth, England, made a discovery that would rewrite our understanding of Viking-Anglo-Saxon relations. While preparing ground for the 2012 Olympics, they uncovered a mass grave containing 54 decapitated skeletons. But this wasn't just another medieval battlefield burial. This was evidence of an execution so systematic and brutal that it has left historians questioning everything they thought they knew about Viking raids in Britain. The skeletons were clearly Viking warriors. Their teeth contained chemical signatures consistent with Scandinavian origins. Their bones showed the wear patterns of men who had lived hard, violent lives, and scattered among them were distinctly Viking artifacts. But they had all met the same grisly end: execution by beheading, followed by the deliberate desecration of their remains. What makes this discovery particularly disturbing is the evidence of what happened during the executions. The men hadn't died quickly. Forensic analysis revealed that many of the victims had defensive wounds on their arms and hands, suggesting they had tried to fight off their executioners even while bound. Some had been struck multiple times before the fatal blow, indicating either inexperienced executioners or deliberate torture. But the most chilling detail was discovered when archaeologists found the heads. They hadn't been buried with the bodies. Instead, they had been carefully arranged in a pile several feet away from the corpses. The skulls showed clear evidence of having been displayed, possibly on spikes, before final burial. This wasn't just execution. This was a deliberate act of humiliation and terror. The positioning of the bodies tells an even more disturbing story. The men had been forced to kneel in a line, facing the same direction, like a medieval assembly line of death. The systematic nature of the execution suggests this wasn't the heat of battle revenge killing that historians might have expected. This was cold, calculated, and organized. Dr. David Score, who led the excavation, described the site as one of the most unsettling he had ever worked on. The evidence suggested that these Vikings had been captured during a raid, held prisoner for some time, and then executed in a carefully orchestrated public spectacle designed to send a message to other would-be raiders. But who were the executioners? Analysis of the cut marks on the vertebrae revealed that the executions had been carried out by skilled swordsmen using high-quality weapons. This wasn't a mob execution. This was carried out by professional warriors, possibly Anglo-Saxon nobles or their retainers. The Headless Vikings of Dorset force us to confront the brutal reality of medieval justice and warfare. They show us that the violence we associate with Viking raids was matched and possibly exceeded by the violent responses of their victims. The discovery suggests that the image of Vikings as unstoppable raiders terrorizing helpless communities might need serious revision. These 54 skeletons lie as silent testimony to a cycle of violence that defined medieval Europe. They remind us that in an age before international law or human rights, might truly did make right, and the consequences of losing a conflict could be far worse than death itself. Discovery number 7, the screaming mummy of the unknown man E. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo sits one of the most disturbing mummies ever discovered. Unlike the serene, carefully preserved pharaohs that populate most Egyptian collections, this mummy's face is frozen in an expression of absolute agony. His mouth gapes open in what appears to be an eternal scream, his features contorted in terror. The ancient Egyptians knew him only as Unknown Man E, but his mummy tells a story that has haunted Egyptologists for over a century. Unknown Man E was discovered in 1881 in the Deir el-Bahari cache, a secret tomb where ancient Egyptian priests had hidden royal mummies to protect them from grave robbers. But even among these ancient royals, Unknown Man E stood out for all the wrong reasons. Unlike the other mummies, which had been carefully preserved according to traditional burial practices, Unknown Man E had been mummified alive. The evidence is written across his body in horrifying detail. His hands and feet had been bound so tightly that the rope marks are still visible on his preserved skin. His body is contorted in an unnatural position that suggests he had struggled violently during the mummification process. Most disturbing of all, his airways show no evidence of the traditional mummification process. His brain had not been removed through his nose. His internal organs had not been carefully extracted, and his body cavities had not been properly cleaned and treated. Instead, Unknown Man E appears to have been wrapped in the linen bandages and natron salts while still breathing. The natural mummification process had preserved not just his body, but his final moments of terror as he slowly suffocated within his own burial wrappings. But who was Unknown Man E? And what had he done to deserve such a horrific fate? Recent DNA analysis has provided some disturbing clues. The mummy appears to be related to the royal family of the 20th dynasty, possibly a son or close relative of Pharaoh Ramesses III. This suggests he wasn't just any criminal, but someone whose crimes were considered so heinous that he deserved a fate worse than death. Historical records from the period describe a conspiracy against Pharaoh Ramesses III known as the Harem Conspiracy. Several members of the royal family, including one of the pharaoh's own sons, plotted to assassinate the king and seize power. The conspiracy was discovered, and the conspirators were arrested and tried. Some were executed in traditional ways, but others, particularly those of royal blood, were condemned to take their own lives. But Unknown Man E's mummy suggests he received an even worse fate. Instead of being allowed the honorable death of suicide, he was subjected to what ancient Egyptians would have considered the ultimate punishment: denial of a proper afterlife. By mummifying him alive, his executioners ensured that his soul would be trapped in eternal agony, unable to pass on to the afterworld. The screaming mummy forces us to confront the sophisticated cruelty that could exist in ancient civilizations. This wasn't just execution. It was eternal torture, a punishment designed to extend beyond death itself. Unknown Man E's anguished face reminds us that even in cultures we admire for their achievements in art and architecture, human beings were capable of unimaginable brutality toward their own kind. Discovery number 8. Nazca skull deformations. High in the deserts of Peru, among the mysterious Nazca lines, archaeologists have discovered something that challenges our understanding of ancient South American cultures. These are the elongated skulls of Nazca. Human remains that are so dramatically altered from normal human anatomy that some have questioned whether they're human at all. The skulls, dating from around 300 CE to 600 CE, are unlike anything seen in normal human populations. They're not just longer than typical human skulls, they're fundamentally different in structure. The cranial capacity is up to 25% larger than normal human skulls. The eye sockets are significantly larger, and most disturbing of all, they have fewer skull sutures than normal humans. Traditional explanations focus on cranial binding, a practice where infant skulls are deliberately deformed through the application of boards and bindings over several years. Many ancient cultures practiced some form of cranial modification, usually for aesthetic or religious reasons. But the Nazca skulls are so dramatically altered that even experts in cranial binding are puzzled. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, who has studied the skulls for over 2 decades, describes them as unlike anything else in the archaeological record. Normal cranial binding can change the shape of a skull, but it can't increase cranial volume or alter the number of sutures. The Nazca skulls suggest either an unknown technique of cranial modification or something far more disturbing. Recent DNA analysis has raised even more questions. Several of the skulls contain genetic markers that don't match known South American populations. The mitochondrial DNA, passed down through the maternal line, contains sequences that some geneticists describe as atypical or unknown. While this could simply represent lost ancient populations, it has fueled more speculative theories about the origins of these remains. But perhaps most unsettling are the child skulls in the collection. These show the same dramatic alterations as the adult skulls, but in some cases, the binding would have been so severe that it would have been fatal. This suggests that the Nazca people were willing to sacrifice children in pursuit of whatever goal these cranial modifications were meant to achieve. The skulls raise uncomfortable questions about ancient South American cultures that we're still struggling to answer. Were these modifications purely aesthetic? Were they markers of social status? Or do they represent something more disturbing? Evidence of systematic child abuse in pursuit of an ideal that we can't even comprehend. The archaeological context makes the skulls even more mysterious. They were found in elaborate tombs, surrounded by precious grave goods, suggesting that these individuals held high status in their society. Whatever was done to their skulls, it wasn't seen as disfigurement. It was seen as improvement, as something worth the obvious suffering it must have caused. The Nazca skulls force us to confront the reality that ancient peoples were capable of modifying their own bodies in ways that seem impossible today. They remind us that the human drive to transcend physical limitations has ancient roots, even when the cost was unimaginable suffering. And they leave us with the disturbing question: what were they trying to become? Discovery number 9. The vampire burials of Eastern Europe. Throughout Eastern Europe, archaeologists have discovered burial sites that tell a terrifying story about how our ancestors dealt with their deepest fears. These are the vampire burials, graves that have been deliberately modified to prevent the dead from rising again. But what makes these discoveries truly disturbing isn't the evidence of belief in vampires. It's the evidence of what people were willing to do to their own dead based on that belief. The classic vampire burial involves a body buried with a large stone placed on its chest, iron spikes driven through its heart, or its head removed and placed between its legs. But some of the burials discovered in Bulgaria, Poland, and Romania go far beyond these traditional methods. Bodies have been found buried face down, with their tongues cut out, their hands and feet bound with iron chains, and wooden stakes driven not just through their hearts, but through every major joint in their bodies. One particular burial site in Bulgaria has yielded over 100 skeletons that show evidence of anti-vampire measures. But what's most disturbing is that many of these measures were applied to children and infants. Tiny skeletons have been found with iron spikes through their chest cavities, their small hands bound with heavy chains. The image of medieval communities so terrified of supernatural threats that they would desecrate the bodies of their own children is deeply unsettling. Dr. Nikolai Ovcharov, who has excavated numerous vampire burial sites, describes the systematic nature of these practices as evidence of widespread panic in medieval Eastern European communities. These weren't isolated cases of superstition. They represent coordinated community responses to perceived supernatural threats. But perhaps most chilling is the evidence that many of these anti-vampire measures were applied to people who had died from disease. Skeletal analysis reveals that many of the vampires had died from cholera, plague, or other infectious diseases. The medieval mind, struggling to understand why disease seemed to spread from the dead to the living, concluded that the deceased were literally returning to kill their neighbors. Recent discoveries have revealed even more disturbing practices. In some cases, the bodies show evidence of having been exhumed and reburied multiple times, with additional anti-vampire measures added with each reburial. This suggests that communities returned again and again to the graves of people they suspected of vampirism, adding new protections as their fears grew. One burial in Romania contained a man who had been decapitated, dismembered, and burned before burial. His ashes had then been mixed with garlic and holy water, and the resulting paste had been buried in a lead-lined coffin. The level of fear and desperation required to take such extreme measures is almost incomprehensible to modern minds. The vampire burials force us to confront the power of fear in human societies. They show us what happens when communities become so terrified of death and disease that they lose their basic humanity. These aren't just archaeological curiosities. They're evidence of mass hysteria so severe that people were willing to mutilate the bodies of their own family members. The burials remind us that the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than we like to believe. When fear takes hold, even the most basic human decencies can be abandoned. The vampire burials of Eastern Europe stand as silent testimony to the terrible things people will do when they believe their very survival is at stake. Discovery number 10. The prehistoric mass grave at Offnet Cave. Our final discovery takes us back to the dawn of human civilization, to a cave in Bavaria where archaeologists uncovered evidence of violence, so systematic and brutal that it has changed our understanding of prehistoric human society. The Offnet Cave mass grave, dating to around 6,500 BCE, contains the remains of at least 38 individuals, mostly women and children, who all died violent deaths on the same day. What makes the Offnet discovery so disturbing isn't just the evidence of mass killing. It's the evidence of what happened after the killing. The skulls had been carefully cleaned of flesh, arranged in neat rows, and buried with elaborate grave goods. This wasn't just massacre. It was ritualized mass murder, followed by ceremonial burial. The forensic evidence paints a horrific picture of the final moments of these prehistoric people. The skull fractures are consistent with blunt force trauma from stone axes and clubs. Many of the victims show defensive wounds on their arms and hands, suggesting they tried to fight back. But perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that many of the children had been killed while being held in their mother's arms. Dr. Andreas Schmidt, who led the modern analysis of the remains, describes the Offnet massacre as one of the most systematic examples of prehistoric violence ever discovered. The attackers hadn't just killed their victims. They had hunted them down methodically, targeting women and children, while the men were presumably away from the settlement. But who were the killers, and why did they take such care with the burial of their victims? The elaborate grave goods and careful arrangement of the skulls suggest this wasn't simple revenge or resource competition. This was ritualized violence, possibly connected to prehistoric religious beliefs about death and the afterlife. Carbon isotope analysis of the bones reveals that the victims came from different geographic regions, suggesting this might have been a gathering of multiple groups that was attacked by outsiders. The diversity of the grave goods supports this theory, with artifacts representing different cultural traditions all buried together. The Offnet Cave discovery has forced archaeologists to reconsider their assumptions about prehistoric society. For decades, many researchers believed that large-scale organized violence was a development of later, more complex civilizations. The Offnet massacre proves that humans were capable of systematic, ritualized mass killing at the very dawn of organized society. Recent DNA analysis has revealed even more disturbing details. Several of the victims were related to each other, representing multiple generations of the same families. Grandmothers, mothers, and children were killed together and buried together. Their family bonds preserved even in death. The Offnet Cave mass grave stands as humanity's oldest evidence of genocide. It shows us that the capacity for organized violence against entire populations is not a modern phenomenon, but something embedded deep in human nature. These 7,500-year-old skulls stare back at us from the dawn of civilization, silent witnesses to humanity's oldest and most terrible sin. The disturbing pattern. As we've journeyed through these 10 archaeological discoveries, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. Each of these finds challenges our comfortable assumptions about the past. They show us that human history is far darker, far more violent, and far more mysterious than we've been willing to admit. But perhaps what's most unsettling about these discoveries is what they tell us about ourselves. The plague pits of London show us how quickly civilization can collapse. The screaming mummies remind us that the line between life and death has always been blurrier than we'd like to believe. The bog bodies reveal that ritual murder was once considered sacred duty. These aren't just ancient horrors. They're mirrors reflecting the darkest aspects of human nature. The same capacity for violence, for cruelty, for systematic brutality that we see in these archaeological sites exists within our own species today. The only real difference is that now we have more efficient tools. The technological sophistication of the Antikythera mechanism reminds us that knowledge can be lost, that civilizations can forget how to build the very machines that once defined their greatness. What else have we forgotten? What other capabilities did our ancestors possess that we've lost to time? The vampire burials show us how fear can transform ordinary people into monsters, how terror can make us willing to desecrate the bodies of our own loved ones. The bone churches demonstrate how death can be transformed into art, how the sacred and the macabre can become indistinguishable. Each of these discoveries forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and human history. They remind us that the past wasn't a simpler, more innocent time. If anything, it was more brutal, more terrifying, and more mysterious than our modern world. The unanswered questions. But beyond the immediate horror of these discoveries lies something even more unsettling. The questions they raise that we cannot answer. Each of these archaeological finds challenges our understanding of human history, but none of them provide clear explanations for what we're seeing. Why were the bog bodies killed in such elaborate, ritualistic ways? What was the purpose behind the systematic torture and murder of these high-status individuals? The bodies themselves are perfectly preserved, but the motivations behind their deaths remain completely mysterious. How did ancient Greeks develop the technology to create the Antikythera mechanism? Where did they acquire the mathematical and astronomical knowledge necessary to build such a sophisticated device? And perhaps most disturbing of all, if they could build this, what else could they build that we haven't found yet? What were the people of Nazca trying to achieve with their dramatic skull modifications? What did they believe would happen if they transformed their children's heads into these elongated shapes? The skulls themselves survive, but the beliefs that motivated their creation are lost to time. Why did medieval communities become so convinced that their dead were rising as vampires, that they were willing to mutilate corpses and desecrate graves? What was happening in these communities that made such extreme measures seem reasonable? The evidence of their fears is buried throughout Eastern Europe, but the source of those fears remains unknown. These questions aren't just academic curiosities. They're reminders of how little we really understand about our own species and our own history. For all our technological sophistication, for all our scientific advancement, we're still looking at the remnants of past civilizations and struggling to understand what we're seeing. The archaeological record is full of gaps, missing pieces that leave us guessing about the motivations, beliefs, and capabilities of our ancestors. And sometimes, those gaps are more frightening than any discovery could be. What this means for us: these archaeological discoveries aren't just historical curiosities, they're warnings. They show us the extremes of human behavior under stress, fear, and desperation. They remind us that civilization is more fragile than we like to believe, and that human nature contains depths of darkness that we prefer not to acknowledge. The plague pits of London demonstrate how quickly social order can collapse when faced with overwhelming crisis. In just a few years, the Black Death transformed European society from a relatively organized civilization into a hellscape where the living could barely manage to dispose of the dead. What would happen if a similar crisis hit our modern world? The vampire burials show us how fear can drive people to commit acts of incredible cruelty against their own communities. When people become convinced that their neighbors pose an existential threat, they become willing to abandon their most basic moral principles. We've seen this pattern repeated throughout history, and it continues to manifest in our modern world. The bog bodies reveal the sophisticated cruelty that can exist within seemingly advanced civilizations. These weren't acts of passion or desperation. They were carefully planned, ritualized killings that entire communities participated in and apparently approved of. It forces us to ask, what rituals might future archaeologists discover from our own time? What practices that we consider normal today might horrify people 1,000 years from now? The Antikythera mechanism reminds us that knowledge can be lost, that entire civilizations can forget how to create the very technologies that once defined their greatness. In our modern world, we depend on technologies that most of us don't understand. What happens if that knowledge is lost? What happens if the systems that maintain our civilization break down? The screaming mummies, both ancient and relatively recent, show us that the boundaries between life and death have always been more complicated than we'd like to believe. Even today, with all our medical advancement, cases of people being declared dead who later revived continue to occur. The fear of being buried alive, of being mistaken for dead, remains one of humanity's deepest terrors. These discoveries aren't just about the past. They're about patterns of human behavior that transcend time and culture. They show us what we're capable of when pushed to our limits, when faced with existential fears, when our comfortable assumptions about reality are challenged.